hit the record now. Rabbi Kimche, please.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. As always, a pleasure to see you all this morning on a Tuesday morning to get together to learn some Torah, even though we're not together physically in the same room or around the table, but this will have to do for the time being. In the meantime, stay safe. Everyone should get vaccinated as soon as possible. And please God, HaKadosh Baruch Hu should have Rachmanas on us. Once the vaccine is reached enough people, that could be a game changer, please God, and life might return to what we used to call normal. But in the meantime, this is a gift min hashamayim to have a facility such as this, to get together, to see each other, to learn together. And I always look forward to these shiurim. I have, Baruch Hashem, several shiurim a week, and gives me a chance to keep in touch with as many people as possible. Okay, in general, what we're looking at is themes in Sefer Bereshis, even though we've already begun to lay in Sefer Shmos, but we're still looking at Sefer Bereshis as we've seen. Lots of the principles in Sefer Bereshis are the foundations of the whole Torah. And the Avos, Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, were considered to be the foundations of Klal Yisrael. Every time we daven and we introduce ourselves once again to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, we say, Elokei Avraham, Elokei Yitzchak, Elokei Yaakov. Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov are our, if you like, our claim to a connection with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And that is really the background to the difficulty that we saw last week. Just to remind you, the Chazal had, if you like, the following difficulty, and that is that Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, in this sense, are to use the language of the Gemara, they are the Merkava Lashchina. They are, in a sense, the chariot. Merkava literally means a chariot, but it means is they were the conduit through which the Shechina came in to mankind. Prior to Avraham Avinu, the world was chaotic from a spiritual point of view. And Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, Sarah, Rivka, Rachel, and Leah brought in the Shechina into the world. It then becomes incomprehensible, if you like, in the minds of Chazal, that Avraham, Yitzchak, Yaakov lived without the mitzvahs. Is it conceivable? Is it conceivable that Avraham, Yitzchak, Yaakov didn't keep Shabbos or ate treifas or lived a life of Aveirus because, of course, it was hundreds of years before Sinai, right? So we saw last week a beautiful tradition in the Gemara in Kiddushin, brought down, I'm just reminding you where we're up to, brought down by Rashi in the Chumash. Eikev Ashashama Avram Bakoli Vayishmar Mishmarti Mitzvosai Chukosai B'Teirosai, says Rashi, this is a reference to Tariq mitzvahs, that in actual fact, Avraham Avinu kept mitzvahs. So we're caught really, let me just talk about this for a few minutes, because we're caught really in between two very difficult ideas in Sefer Bereshis. One idea is that the Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov lived as, if you like, as goyim. They lived as goyim. It's not possible. It seems to be inconceivable in the eyes of Chazal that Avraham, Yitzchak, Yaakov lived in a way which we today would consider like goyim, without Shabbos, without kashrus, without Yomim Tovim, without all the mitzvahs that are hallmarks of being members of Klal Yisrael. Is that at all possible? Chaim Soloveitchik, for example, has a whole essay on the subject where he says it's completely inconceivable that Avraham, Yitzchak, Yaakov, who were the Shoresh, who were the Yesod on which the whole of Klal Yisrael is built, that they are not engaging in the basic mitzvahs of Klal Yisrael. And yet, we all know that it was hundreds of years before Matan Torah, and there's no Torah given yet, and there's no indication in the Pasuk at all that Avram is, for example, eating kosher or keeping Shabbos. There's no indication in the Pasuk at all. Nevertheless, Chazal took this view that the Avos were the Merkava Lashchina. Just by the way, there's a very interesting little remez the Arizal brings down about the Avos and the Mohos being a Merkava Lashchina. those people who like gematrius and the remez level in the Torah. So the Arizal writes that, of course, the Shem Hashem, Yud Kei Vav Kei, was really unknown in the world before the Avos came. Vayikra b'Shem Hashem, Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, their job was, if you like, to spread emunah. But Yud Kei Vav Kei says the gematria of Yud Kei Vav Kei famously is 26. It's 26, right? Yud Kei Vav Kei adds up to 26. So says the Arizal, if you look at the names of the Avos and the Yamars, you see something very interesting. That look at Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. Avram has got Aleph, Beis, Reish, Hey, Mem has got 5 letters. Yitzchak is Yud, Tzadi, Ches, Kuf has got 4 letters, so we're up to 9, right? And Yaakov is Yud, Ayin, Kuf, Beis, another 4, so they're 13 letters. That Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov is spelled with 13 letters. And now let's look at Sarah, Rivka, Rachel, and Leah. If you look at Sarah, Rivka, Rachel, and Leah, Sarah is 3, right? Sin, Reish, Hey, right? Rivka is 4, Reish, Beis, Kuf, Hey, so we're up to 7. Rachel is 3, is Reish, Chet, Lam, we're up to 10. And Leah is 3, Lamed, Aleph, Hey. So Sarah, Rivka, Rachel, and Leah are also written with 13 letters. So the 13 letters of the names of the Avos, plus the 13 letters of the names of the Imahos, add up to the 26, which is Yud Kei Vav Kei. So this is what we call remez. Are you following me? That that deeply rooted in the nature of the letters of the Torah and their values, right? There is also a hidden message of various sorts. The idea of the Avos and the Imahos, each one of them, if you like, playing a role to carry the Shem Hashem. The name of HaKadosh Baruch Hu should be accessible in the world. We should be able to understand HaKadosh Baruch Hu and connect with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and in that way to change the whole direction that mankind was going in. That was the achievement of the Avos and the Imahos. And this little gematria is something easy to remember and to think about. And therefore, I think I believe that this is really the background to the understanding of Chazal. That if indeed they were the Merkava Lashchina, it must be the case that there was some. That there were mitzvahs already accessible to them. It's not possible that they were living in a way which we would consider to be a goyim. How could they possibly live as goyim if they are the yesod of Klal Yisrael and the basis from which everything comes? It must be the case that they had mitzvahs, and that's Rashi. And we saw in Rashi, interestingly takes this Medrash Chazal and he presents it to us in his commentary. In a very simple, straightforward way, that's pshat in the pasuk. Vayishmo mishmarti chukosai mitzvosai v'terosai means all the mitzvahs, right? All the mitzvahs asay and lo saseh, all the mitzvahs in the Torah were known to them, and therefore, according to if we take this literally, then Rashi wants us to understand that Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov are walking around wearing tzitzis and davening and keeping Shabbos and doing all sorts of mitzvahs which we associate with Klal Yisrael, right? If you take this literally. I mentioned to you last time, and you're going to hear this from me repeatedly throughout all our shiurim, that everybody agrees that Midrashi Chazal have to be taken very seriously. Chazal wrote what they wrote because they wanted to give us a very serious message. The only question is whether they're meant to be taken literally or not. In other words, maybe the message is metaphorical. That's a possibility, right? So that is the second, if you like, perspective on this parsha. That's why I'm interested in this particular theme, and I want to speak about it again today, is because I think this theme is a classic example of where the Gedolei HaMafarshim, we looked at Rashi, we looked at the Rambam, the Sforno, we're going to come back to that in a minute, where they are grappling with this one question. Are the words of Chazal meant to be literal or meant to be metaphorical, right? They're certainly meant to be serious. They're meant to be telling us something very profound and very beautiful, right? And they're meant to be telling us that actually the Avos lived a life of Kedusha and Tahara and Emunah and Avodas Hashem, all the things that we associate with mitzvahs, right? We associate a life of mitzvahs with a life of the service of God. And therefore, if you want to understand these Chazal metaphorically, right, you would say that, of course, they weren't wearing tzitzis. Of course, they weren't keeping Shabbos. Torah hadn't been given yet. How should they know about it, right? Nevertheless, their madrega was a level of the service of God which we today associate with Taryag mitzvahs. In other words, it's a type of anachronism. It's a type of way of taking our language and projecting it backwards 4,000 years to the lives of the Avos, and in that way trying to make sense of the lives of Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, and understand what Sefer Bereshis is about. Of course, we looked at, just to remind you, we looked at the Ramban, who is concerned that if it's true that they kept the mitzvahs, how come, for example, Yaakov marries two sisters and Amram marries his aunt in violation of the Torah? So he comes up with a completely new chiddush. His new chiddush is that when Chazal said that they kept the mitzvahs, that was only in Eretz Yisrael. When they were in Eretz Yisrael, somehow being located within Eretz Yisrael gave them a special kedusha, and maybe even, according to the Ramban, a special nevuah, a special understanding, prophetic understanding of the mitzvahs. But once they left Eretz Yisrael, like, for example, Yaakov marries two sisters in the house of Lavan, and Amram marries his aunt in Mitzrayim. So we're dealing with events that took place outside of Eretz Yisrael, and we're going to look a bit more closely at this shitta of the Rambam. This topic is connected actually with a deeper understanding of what is the whole idea of B'nai Noach. There is a concept in halacha and relevant to our understanding of Sefer Bereshis that B'nai Noach means is a reference, a halachic reference to, if you like, mankind. Mankind, not members of Klal Yisrael, but mankind. But B'nai Noach are generally referred to as people who are living a life, I mentioned last week, Noachides, right? That they are living according to the Sheva Mitzvahs B'nai Noach, the 7 Noachide laws. That was the basic moral code that Adam HaRishon was given, that Noach was given, and all of mankind are obligated to live up to these 7 Noachide laws, which give them a basic, if you like, standing and status in the eyes of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. They don't have to keep the Torah because they're not Jewish. The Torah is very much a later refinement. We looked at the Rambam, just to remind you, the Rambam in Hilchos Melachim, who gives us a sort of an evolution of mitzvahs. Right? He says that Adam HaRishon got 6 mitzvahs, Noach got the 7th, Avram then got Bris Milah, right? We saw there was a sort of a development, slowly, and it's important to note, incidentally, that the Rambam, right, completely and utterly does not accept literally the idea that the Avos kept the mitzvahs. The Rambam, of course, also knew about this Medrash Chazal, but for him, this was, as I mentioned earlier, this was a metaphor. It was simply describing the way in which the Avos and the Imahos lived on a level of Kedusha and on a level of Avodat Hashem. But the Rambam, at no point does he even suggest that Avram Avinu was walking around wearing tzitzis, whereas Rashi does. So this is an interesting debate among the Rishonim. It's a debate which we can't resolve one way or another. It depends a little bit on how you want to understand and how you want to read Midrashi Chazal. The Sforno takes it a little bit further. I'd like to just have a look again at some of the text. Let's see if I can get these texts up. Just hold on a second. Okay, have to give me a moment to get my text up. Second. Okay, let's have a look here. Right. Can you see a text? Yes? Good, lovely. So just we looked at this very quickly at the end of the shir last week. I want to have a closer look at it now. This is the Sforno, right? The Sforno, one of the classic commentaries of the 15th century, and a very interesting angle. So the pasuk which says that the Avos kept my mitzvahs, it says Vayishmor Mishmarti, that they kept those things that I asked them to guard. Right? They guarded, right? Vayishmor, like V'shomru b'nei Yisrael, it's Shabbos. It means to observe certain principles and not to violate them. So says the Sforno, look at this. Also Tomid, that Avram and the others constantly did what? Hamishmeres hamiyuchedesli. That very special quality which I always preserve, which is special, which is unique to me. This is HaKadosh Baruch Hu speaking. In other words, HaKadosh Baruch Hu says there are certain qualities which are unique to me, which the others understood, and they preserved. What is that, for example? So according to the Medrash that we learned, Vayishmor Mishmarti means they kept the mitzvahs. They wore tzitzis and kept Shabbos. But the Sforno wants to deviate from that. He doesn't want to take literally. The Sforno is a follower often of the Rambam. He doesn't want to take literally these midrashim. But clearly the Pasuk is saying something special. And clearly we also understand that Abraham and Yitzchak Yaakov weren't ordinary B'nai Noach. They were clearly living a much more elevated spiritual life. As I mentioned earlier, they were the Merkava, Lashchina. They were the carriers and the conduit for bringing God's presence into the world. So what is the Mishram Yuchedesli? Shehi Ligmol Chesed. So for the Sforno, Lishma Mishmarti means to live a life of Chesed. In other words, Abram understood, not because he had a Shulchan Aruch, not because he knew Tariag Mitzvahs, but he understood that the nature of HaKadosh Baruch Hu was a nature of Gemilus Chasad, of giving, rather than taking. That the emphasis is on giving, finding opportunities to give. Ka'omroi, right? And he quotes now a pasuk from Mishlei, Kol orchos Hashem chesed ve'emes, right? Lahoros chatoim baderech, right? Beautiful pasuk, right? So lahoros chatoim baderech means if you meet chatoim, in other words, and for the others it meant if you meet pagans, what you have to do is kol orchos Hashem chesed ve'emes lahoros, to teach chatoim, people who are off the derech, baderech, to bring them back onto the derech. And so what did he teach the non-Jews? Right? What was Avraham teaching the non-Jews? He was teaching them, okay, let's just stop here for a second. So this is the Sforno, it's got very beautiful mahalech throughout Sefer Bereshis, which is Avraham Avinu had really, was giving seminars, right? Avraham, I don't know, lots of you have been maybe to seminars, right? That the Avraham Avinu was teaching seminars, and in these seminars there were two main courses. One was called Emunah, and one was called Chesed. This was the messages of Avraham Avinu. He was teaching Emunah and Chesed. But says now Chesed is not part of the Sheva Mitzvahs B'nai Noach. That is something way beyond. The Sheva Mitzvahs B'nai Noach are really just a basic moral code, not to murder, steal, commit adultery, these sort of things, and not to blaspheme. But the engaging in Chesed and teaching people about Chesed, and that whatever we have in life is a gift from HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and that's our obligation to, and that's the Chastei Hashem, right? We start off every Shemona Esra by saying HaKadosh Baruch Hu is Gomel Chasodim Tovim V'Konei Hakol. So our initial contact with HaKadosh Baruch Hu is that he is Gomel Chasodim Tovim, that he's a constant source of Shefa Bracha to this world. And whatever we have in this world, whether it's health or wealth or children or family or gift, any gifts that we have are gifts from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And to acknowledge those gifts, right, that is fundamental to our Avodas Hashem. But this is something that Avram Avinu, he got it. He understood this totally, and that's what he was teaching, right? And that's why when he invited people in, he was Avram's house, as we know, traditionally was open on all four sides. He invited everybody in. Who was everybody? Everybody were the pagans, the goyim, right? They came into his house, and he gave them food, right? But before he gave them food, and after he gave them food, he asked them, he discussed it with them. He used the food as a seminar, right? And the seminar was, where do you think this food came from? How do you think it is that the tree happens to produce exactly the right item, which we find pleasurable and nutritious? How did that work? Is that just a chance? No, this is the Yad Hashem. And so he would get them to make a bracha, right? Maybe he didn't have the nusach of the brachas that we've got, but he made up his own brachas. And when they'd finished, he would get them to say Birkas Hamazon. He didn't have our text of Birkas Hamazon, right? Does anybody know what the Gemara, what the Medrash says? What was the Birkas Hamazon of Avraham Avinu? Right? Anybody knows what the Medrash says? Avraham Avinu's Birkas Hamazon was Baruch she'ochalnu mishaloi uvatuvoi chayinu. That's the bracha. So if you're short of time, ladies and gentlemen, I'm not recommending this as a substitute Birkas Hamazon, but the Medrash says that was Avraham Avinu fulfilled the mitzvah of Achalta v'Savata Beirachta by saying Baruch she'ochalnu mishaloi uvatuvoi chayinu. Those 5 words is basically acknowledging what? It's saying that all the tuvoi, all the benefits that we have in this world, that we get up in the morning and the sun is shining and the world is functioning and there's oxygen to breathe and there are people to meet and there's Torah to whatever it is that we're doing, that is all betuvoi chayinu. Out of his goodness, he's given us chayinu, he's given us life. So that's what the Sforno is saying. Sforno is saying, of course, Avram Avinu was the Yesod, was the source of all future Klal Yisrael, and he certainly wasn't an ordinary guy, and he wasn't even an ordinary Ben Noach. An ordinary Ben Noach who was simply careful not to violate the laws of the 7 Noachide laws. He was someone who was engaging in Vayishma Mishmarti. Let's have a look again at this text of the Sforno. Vayishma Mishmarti means, so he says, that kol orchos Hashem chesed ve'emes or laharos chatoim baderech, that he was b'zeh also kasher koro b'shem Hashem. The pasuk mentions a couple of times about Avraham Avinu. What was he doing with his life? It says vayikro b'shem Hashem. He was traveling around. Instead, with Avraham, it's never written that he had a bayis. He never had a house. Avraham Avinu never lived in a house. Abraham and Yitzchak didn't have houses. They only lived in tents. And the reason why they were tents, because they wanted to be mobile. They were holach v'nosoah. He was going backward and forward. He was traveling around everywhere. And whenever he met Canaanim and Chittim and Emorim, he would say to them, let me teach you something. Let me teach you something. Let me teach you the power of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the creator of the world, and that everything we have is from his hand. And that was, says the Sforno, that's what it means by Yishmor Mishmarti. By Yishmor Mishmarti, that was the uniqueness of Avraham Avinu, that he understood the midas of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, right? Later on, when the Torah is given, so actually one of the Tariag mitzvahs is V'holachta bidrochav. V'holachta bidrochav is a complicated idea. Maybe once we'll spend a shir looking at it a bit more closely, but it means that the Torah has given us a glimpse of kaviyachol, so to speak, qualities of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And those qualities of HaKadosh Baruch Hu are not really his qualities, because HaKadosh Baruch Hu is Ein Sof, is indescribable, he's in the world of the infinite. But the Torah describes HaKadosh Baruch Hu as having certain qualities in order that we could maybe emulate them in some way. We could maybe in some way learn from it. And that starts as far as Avraham Avinu. Avraham Avinu, he gets it, that the primary mid of HaKadosh Baruch Hu is Gomel Chasodim Tovim, and therefore, if we want to in some way emulate that mitzvah, right, we can then in some way we can fulfill this idea Vayishmar Mishmarti, of following in the ways of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And this is a very beautiful piece of Sforno. I think this Sforno, in this whole topic of us keeping the mitzvahs, this is one of my favorite pieces. And then he says, so how does the pasuk continue? V'shama mitzvosai chukosai v'teirosai. What is mitzvosai chukosai v'teirosai? Says as Sforno, that is Sheva Mitzvahs B'nai Noach. Shenitztavu B'nai Noach, right? The mitzvahs that the B'nai Noach were commanded, right? U'v'chein hoya no'eh doresh v'no'eh makayim. That's a language of Chazal. A person is no'eh doresh v'no'eh makayim, means that he practiced what he preached. In other words, he was teaching the Sheva Mitzvahs B'nai Noach, and he was fulfilling them to the nth degree. Kamoifes the Rabbi, very beautiful language. That what is it? What is a moface? What does it mean? Kamoifes the Rabbi. Moface the Rabbi means he was what they call in Ivrit a dugma ishit. A dugma ishit means what we call it in English, a role model. He was a role model. In other words, his way of life was a role model, so that anybody who met him realized, I'm meeting somebody who is living a more elevated, refined life. And he would teach them the Sheva Mitzvahs B'nai Noach, the 7 Noachide laws. And in addition to it, he would teach them something which is not in the Sheva Mitzvahs B'nai Noach, which is the idea of chesed in every way. In every way possible. I'd like to share with you just briefly something I came across recently about the Sheva Mitzvahs B'nai Noach, which I find fascinating, in the Tshuvos of Rav Moshe Feinstein. So Rav Moshe Feinstein, the great gadol in halacha of the 20th century, was really a most prolific writer and thinker, way beyond simply the halachic ins and outs of everyday life. And he really, apart from, if you like, modernizing the halachic system, in other words, he gave halachic rulings on electricity, electronics, about IVF and air travel. That was the modern life of the 20th century. All the halachic principles connected to all these issues are found in the writings of Rav Moshe Feinstein. Sadly, I never had the zechus to meet him, but I've had the opportunity to learn a lot of his Torah, so I do feel quite close to him. And I came across something very fascinating, which is somebody asked him about whether a non-Jewish person, does a non-Jewish person have a mitzvah to daven to HaKadosh Baruch Hu? Is that a mitzvah that a non-Jewish person has? In other words, if you have a non-Jew who wants to daven, right? Do we say to him, no, don't daven because that's something which is Jewish? But is there a mitzvah? Now we're talking about a ben Noach, means somebody who is God-fearing and moral, right? He's living a God-fearing moral life, right? And he's living within the parameters of the 7 mitzvahs b'nai Noach. But the Sheva Mitzvahs B'nai Noach don't actually contain really mitzvot asay, don't really contain positive mitzvahs, really negative mitzvahs, right? And the positive mitzvah of davening, would they have that mitzvah? So first of all, he starts off by saying that if non-Jew wishes to daven, that's for sure, he says, that he can daven as an eino mitzvah v'oseh. In other words, even if he's not obligated to do it, he can do it optionally. He can daven to HaKadosh Baruch Hu optionally, and we even find, so he says, it brings down the pasuk in Yeshaya, which is V'haviosi el ha'kodshi, v'simachti b'beis tefilasi, alosayim b'zivchein rot al mizbechi, and how does that pasuk end? Ki beisi, beis tefillah, l'chol ha'amim, right? That the Beis HaMikdash was a beit tefillah l'chol ha'amim, that all the nations of the world were welcome to come and daven at the Beis HaMikdash, right? So they couldn't bring, let's say, a Korban Pesach, because that's a uniquely Jewish connection, but they could come and daven to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And indeed, in Melachim Aleph, chapter 8, if you look at one of the greatest rabbinic droshes ever given, Shlomo HaMelech's drosha at the inauguration of the Beis Hamikdash. He invites everybody to come and daven at this at the temple, and then he says, and also the non-Jew, who is a God-fearing non-Jew, is welcome to come here, and we welcome him to come and daven to God in our Beis Hamikdash. And that's a very interesting theme. And then Rav Moshe Feinstein goes on into a very interesting analysis. He says it's true that the non-Jew is not obligated to daven, but let's think about this a bit more deeply. The non-Jew has a mitzvah of emunah, in other words, he believes in God, right? If he just keeps the Shev Mitzvah of Bnei Noach without believing in God, that's nothing, right? The idea of the Shev Mitzvah Bnei Noach is that out of a belief in God, he believes that God wants us to live a moral and God-fearing life. I've met, incidentally, Christians who are definitely qualify as Bnei Noach, as people who are God-fearing and leading a moral life, no question about it. But the way in which Rav Moshe develops it is he says when it comes to davening, there are two different types of davening. There is the regular daily avodas Hashem davening, which the non-Jew is clearly not obligated to do, but he can if he likes. But there's a different sort of tefillah, says the Rav Moshe Feinstein, and he brings all sorts of sources for it. There's a type of tefillah which is ba'es tzara. Tefillah ba'es tzara. The person davens at times of great need, where he feels desperate, feels really that he needs desperately the hand of HaKadosh Baruch Hu to help him with something. So he says that is an integral part of emunah. Emunah means not just that a God exists, but it means that God is involved in our life and he can really help us. So to daven ba'es tzara, he says, is something which even a non-Jew, a Ben Noach, is obligated to do. He's obligated, why? Because he has emunah. The emunah, everybody who has emunah is obligated to daven to HaKadosh Baruch Hu ba'es tzara. In times of difficulty, in times of hardship, in times where he feels intensely something is happening which he needs HaKadosh Baruch Hu's help for, at that point, tefillah takes on a different form completely. And that is actually an integral part of emunah, right? So Avraham Avinu is actually teaching. What is he teaching? He's teaching the pagans of this world. He's teaching that there is such a thing as davening to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, because HaKadosh Baruch Hu is Gomer Chasadim Tovim, and we need to connect to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. That's the Merkava Lashchina idea. That HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Avraham Avinu is going around teaching everybody that they need to lead a different sort of life. It's an interesting question. What happened to all the people who were the disciples of Avraham Avinu? We're not quite sure exactly what happened to them, right? They didn't, their future is a bit unclear in the narrative of the Chumash, right? The narrative of the Chumash only gives us the continuation of Klal Yisrael through Mitzrayim, through Har Sinai into Eretz Yisrael. What happened to all the people that Avraham Avinu taught? Right? So it could be that he taught them and they managed to achieve maybe a higher level of life, but they couldn't transmit it to their children. The point of Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov is that they had this emunah and they were able, v'shinantam levanecha, able to teach it to their children. Anyhow, all this is contained, certainly referred to, in this very fascinating subject about how did the Avos actually live. And this is really, in my mind, one of the greatest themes in the whole of Sefer Bereshis. How did they live? So, summarize just for a minute. Rashi says, let's take the words of the Gemara in Kiddushin literally. The Avos kept the mitzvahs. Full stop. They kept the mitzvahs. The Ramban adds to that, if you remember, he says that's clear that even according to Rashi and the Gemara, they kept the mitzvahs. They weren't obligated to keep the mitzvahs. They were not mitzuvah v'osa, right? If you remember, there is, I mentioned to you last week, in every mitzvah, there's a difference between what Chazal call the kiyum ha-mitzvah and the chiyuv ha-mitzvah, right? The obligation to do the mitzvah is one thing, and fulfilling the mitzvah is something a person can fulfill a mitzvah that he's not obligated to do, right? So the Ramban says that even according to Rashi, the Avos kept the mitzvahs without a tzivui. There was no commandment to them The only commandment Avram got was the bris milah. But apart from that, there were no other commandments that were given. But he kept the mitzvahs eina mitzvah v'osa. If you remember, the Ramban also gives us a second option, which is, he says, al derech hapshat. Right? Al derech hapshat. Let's have a quick, just review that for 1 minute, and then we'll have a look at the next piece. So the Ramban says here, the Ramban. So he says, at first he says, Vaniri elai midas rabbeinu. So he says, if you want to know the Gemara says, Shalomad Avram Avinu HaTorah Kula Baruch HaKodesh, right? That he knew that he had a foresight of the Torah prophetically, and he learned it and he understood it to its deepest level. But the Shoma also, he observed it, Kamisha Eino Mitzvah V'osa. That's the Ramban, right? But then the Ramban goes down. The Ramban continues here, al derech hapshat. Al derech hapshat, he says all this pasuk simply means that whatever HaKadosh Baruch Hu told Avram to do, he did. When he told him, lech lecha la'artzecha, lech lecha, he went. When he told him to do the Akedah, he went. That's what it means. That is the meaning according to the Rambam. What I'd like to have a look at now is something we haven't seen yet, which is the Orach Chaim HaKadosh. A couple of words about the Orach Chaim HaKadosh, right? Orach Chaim HaKadosh, one of the most fascinating perushim on the Chumash, right? But very difficult. The reason why his commentary is difficult is that the Orach Chaim HaKadosh was fundamentally a Kabbalist. Fundamentally, he was one of the Mekubalim, and he was teaching Kabbalah. He was also a posek and a Rav of a big Kehillah in Morocco. He was one of the Gedolei Yisrael in Morocco about 250 years ago. In the mid-1700s, or maybe the early 1700s, Orach Chaim HaKadosh was one of the Gedolim in North Africa, in Morocco. And eventually, and he was teaching Kabbalah and Halacha and everything, and he wrote this very amazing Perush HaTorah, which has got so many really gems in it. If you ever get a chance to look at some of the, there are some books out sort of just giving some of the beautiful ideas in the Orach Chaim HaKadosh. At a certain point, he decided he has to come on Aliyah. Ladies and gentlemen, something that some of us here have done in our lives, decide that living in Chutz La'aretz is not a long-term solution. And he was in the 1700s, before Nefesh B'Nefesh, and before the Mishrat HaKlitah, and he came to Israel. Of course, the sort of Israel he found here was pretty bleak. Israel in the 1700s was poverty-stricken, and there was no real income or business, and it was dangerous, and there were plagues, and there were all sorts of, it was a very, very wretched place to live. But he came here, the Orach Chaim HaKadosh came in the 1700s with tremendous Mesiras Nefesh, even traveling here by boat and by camel and who knows what. But he made it. He was determined to come. He also believed, incidentally, that Mashiach was round the corner. He believed that coming to Eretz Yisrael was vital because Mashiach was going to come basically in 1781. That's what he believed, that he had a date where he thought he knew when Mashiach was going to come. So he wanted to be in Eretz Yisrael when Mashiach came because that's the place to be. When Mashiach comes, you want to be in Eretz Yisrael. Anyway, I won't go into that for the moment. But in the 1700s, there was a tremendous energy in Europe and even in North Africa, among the Mekubalim particularly, that Mashiach was imminent. That's why Moshe Chaim Luzzatto went to Israel in the 1700s, and the Vilna Gaon tried to go, and the Talmidei Baal Shem Tov went. Lots of people went to Israel at that point for messianic reasons. But that's not my point. My point is, Orach Chaim HaKadosh came here. Some of you might have seen in the old city, there's a Beit Knesset. Have you seen that? There's a Beit Knesset Orach Chaim. And there's a Rechov Orach Chaim. There's a street. Next time we go to the old city, the street, the Orach Chaim street, one of the streets actually you walk down. If you walk from the main entrance to the old city through down to the coastal. You walk through Rehov Orach Chaim HaKadosh, and in it is a Beit HaKnesset Orach Chaim, and he became a Rav of a Kehillah in Yerushalayim for a few years, the last few years of his life, and he's buried in Har HaZeisim. So he was really one of the heroes, really, one of the leaders, the heroes, the thinkers of the 18th century, a contemporary. He was the Sephardic contemporary of the Vilna Gaon, the Sephardi contemporary of Moshe Chaim Luzzatto. He was somebody who was living in a very, very difficult time, but a very important time in terms of the creation of Klal Yisrael. And his commentary, the Orach Chaim HaKadosh, is considered to be something completely unique and beautiful. I remember my Rosh Yeshiva, Rabbi Chaim Shmulevitz, Zecher Tzaddik Livracha, was an amazing leader of Klal Yisrael and a Talmud Chacham, one of the greatest Talmidei Chachamim I've ever met in my life. So he was a Litvak, a real, honest, total Litvak, and he wasn't big about davening at Kivrei Tzadikim. It was not one, among the Litvaks, davening at Kivrei Tzadikim was not a big thing. It was really it's more of a Hasidic and Sephardic issue, not so much among the Litvaks. But once a year, he would go on the yard side of the Orach Chaim HaKadosh. He would go to the kever of the Orach Chaim HaKadosh on Har HaZeisim, and he would say a tefillah. So that was, as far as I know, was the only one of the Kivrei Tzadikim that he had a connection to. Even though he was the arch Litvak, that meant a lot to him, the kever of the Orach Chaim HaKadosh. Okay, having said all that, let's have a look at the Orach Chaim on a very interesting pasuk. The pasuk reads as follows. This is Vayechi, a couple of weeks ago. Reuven b'chori ata. Reuven, you are my firstborn, right? Kochi bereshis only, the first fruit of my strength. Yes, as v'yesas, exceeding in rank and exceeding in honor, right? But what is Yaakov actually saying to Reuven? He's saying, despite the fact that you're my firstborn and that you have got exceeding honor and rank, I'm not going to give you the status of the firstborn. The firstborn in biblical status was the firstborn got a double share. Yaakov at the end of his life is handing out his last will and testament. And what does he do? He does something remarkable, right? Let's just speak about that for one moment. Well, he does something remarkable. He takes the Bechorah, the firstborn status, and what does he do? He gives it to whom? Who gets the firstborn status, Rabbi Sai? Any offers on this? I can't. You have to unmute yourself. If you want to say anything, you have to unmute yourself.
Yosef.
Yosef. Who said that? Yosef.
I did.
Yes. Okay, Yosef, exactly. The only one of the 12 sons who gets a double portion. Right? Menashe and Ephraim was the double portion that Yosef gave, and by giving Yosef the double portion, he was in fact saying, Yosef is my firstborn. Was Yosef a firstborn? The answer is, well, yes and no. He was the firstborn of Rachel. Are you with me? So Yosef is the firstborn of Rachel. Reuven is the firstborn of Leah. What is Yaakov doing here? He is shifting the firstborn status away from the firstborn of Leah to the firstborn of Rachel. Okay. Now the halacha is that the din of the firstborn in terms of inheritance is not the firstborn of the mother, but it's the firstborn of the father. And therefore that's clear that Yaakov's firstborn was Reuven. And yet Reuven was, in a certain sense, disinherited, and Yosef was favored. Asks the so now we're going to have a look at the Orach Chaim HaKadosh. Says Orach Chaim, V'kodem lovoi lebir haksuvim. Before we go into the details of these psukim, yesh lanu lachkor chakira achas. I want to delve into a particularly difficult question. Vehi, eich oso Yaakov hefech ma shekosav b'Torah. How could Yaakov go exactly against a mitzvah in the Torah in Parshas Kiseitze, where it says, Lo yuchal levaker es ben ha'ahuvo al pnei ben hasenua habachor. Okay, so the word habachor means the firstborn, and this man has got two wives. One is ahuva, is beloved, and the other is senua. Okay, senua literally means hated, but doesn't mean really hated. It means less beloved. Let's put it that way. So he's got two wives. One is beloved, and one is less beloved, right? And what does the pasuk say? Lo yuchal levaker. Levaker is a verb derived from the noun bechor, the first. He can't promote as a firstborn the ben ho'ahuva, the son of his beloved wife, and prefer that son on Panei ben Hasnua habachor, if the real Bechor came from his less beloved wife, right? So here we have, says the Orach Chaim HaKadosh, this seems to be a perfect description of Yaakov Avinu. We know clearly from the Psukim that Rachel was the Ahuva and Leah was less beloved. Incidentally, it's worth mentioning that we all know that in biblical times, it was permitted polygamy for a man to marry more than one wife, but it's also worth noting that throughout the Torah actually gives us a double message on the subject of polygamy. The Torah says, yes, polygamy is permitted, but it comes with a health warning, right? Every single case of polygamy in the Tanakh, without exception, led to sometimes disaster, and if not disaster, it led to a tremendous amount of discord within the family. Whether it was Sarah and Hagar, whether it was Rachel and Leah, whether it was Hannah and Penina, the Torah emphasizes that the polygamy created tremendous discord. And even in the Hebrew language, right? The word for does anyone know what is the word for a second wife? What is the name in Hebrew? Anyone know what it is? Any offers? What is the word?
Sarah.
Sarah, that's right. Tzadi Reish Hey. To take a second wife into the house is to bring a tzara into your house. Now that's an extraordinary word to use. Who doesn't know what is tzoros, right? Tzoros just means aggravation. It means discord. It means trouble. So it's actually an amazing subject. There's again a subject maybe for a longer shir, that the Torah tells yes, it's permitted polygamy, right? But at the same time, it's highly not recommended. Okay, 1,000 years ago, Rabbeinu Gershon legislated in Europe for the Ashkenaz that it was forbidden. And therefore in the Shulchan Aruch it says polygamy is forbidden for Bnei Ashkenaz. But before Rabbeinu Gershon said that 1,000 years ago, from the very beginning, the concept of polygamy was permitted, but it was not recommended. And we find that generally speaking, Adam HaRishon only has one wife, Noach has one wife, Moshe has one wife, Aaron has one wife. Most of the Gedolim in the Torah are described as having only one wife. So you find that actually it's not the recommended way, and the word tzara is in a sense the loudest message against it. But I call upon him, one thing is clear, that Yaakov Avinu did have two wives, and it's clear that he preferred Rachel over Leah. And it's clear that at the end of his life, he promotes Rachel's firstborn over the firstborn of Leah. So let's have a look at this. Says we must inquire, right? How is it that Yaakov went against an explicit biblical prohibition to pass the birthright from the son of a beloved wife to the firstborn of a less beloved wife? The Kodem, he says, the Kodem, and before that, Tzarich lo seis leiv el ha'im ha'ovos hoyo aleim chiyuv kiyum kol ha'Torah. Right? So we first have to ask in order for this question to make sense, we have to ask the question, did the Avos have an obligation to learn to keep the Torah at all? Maybe the simple answer is yes. The Torah obligates us not to transfer the birthright, but the Avos didn't keep it. So it's very, very easy. Now look at this very interesting line here. That's what we learned last week. Ramban, that he explained how was it that Yaakov Nosam Beis Achayas, how is it that Yaakov married two sisters? Kilo Hoyo Be'eretz. It was outside of Eretz Yisrael, Ad Kan. And look at this is a very interesting example of a polite but firm disagreement. It says, Ve'ein devorov chazokim besmuchos. His words are not well founded. Right? You must understand, this is the Orach Chaim HaKadosh in the 1700s, speaking about the Ramban, who was 500 years earlier, and saying the Ramban says this, but his words are not founded on anything. And look at the language here. Ki mi gilo loy soid zeh. Who revealed to the Ramban this soid, this secret? Where does he get this from? I don't know any source for this at all, right? And the Orach Chaim HaKadosh is saying there's no source for this either in the Chumash or in the Talmud or in the Zohar or any of the Kabbalistic sources. That he's made it up. So the Orach Chaim is not happy with this piece of Ramban, but even after the Orach Chaim's criticism, the Ramban still remains the Ramban, you understand. There's no difference between Eretz Yisrael and Chutz La'aretz in these matters. In other words, what are we talking about? We're talking about matters of the birthright or who you can marry. That's nothing to do with Eretz Yisrael. Now look at the way he describes this, and I think this is a beautiful piece of text with which we can finish the shir. Hanochon ba'einai. Orach Chaim, the great Kabbalist, says, Ki ha'avos kiblu ha'torah mishem. Look at this. The Avos learned Torah from who? From Shem. Shem is who? Shem is the son of Noach. Okay? And we find in Rashi in a few places that the Avos go and they learn in the yeshiva of Shem the Aver. And the question is, what were they learning in the yeshiva of Shem the Aver? What were they teaching there? So he says, Shem had the Torah. He had a preview of the Torah. Shekibel mi Noach. And Shem learned it from his father Noach. Shekibel me Chanoch, who received it from Chanoch. Shekibel me Adam Harishon. Right? And he received it from Adam Harishon. So the Orach Chaim HaKadosh is giving us a little glimpse of a Kabbalistic thesis. In Kabbalah, this is taken as read. This is taken as a fundamental principle that Adam Harishon received a Torah. Received a Torah. What did Adam Harishon get? Asher lomda b'pi ha'gvura. Right? And he had learned it from b'pi ha'gvura, means from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. The Chsiv az ra'ah v'yomer Adam in the Zohar. So he brings down the Zohar. He says, if you know the Zohar, you will know that the Zohar says that Adam Harishon, in the story of Adam and Chava, right? The drama takes place around the Eight Hadas. That's where they did their Aveira, eating from the tree they weren't allowed to eat. But there is also in the story of Gan Eden, there's also the Eight Zakayim. Eight Zakayim. But not much is said about the Eight Zakayim. In Kabbalah, the Eight Zakayim was a primordial Torah. It was a Torah which he was given. What exactly was written in it? What was the idea? We don't know exactly what it was, but it was a pre-Matan Torah, which was given to Adam Harishon as his personal, if you like, source of all wisdom. Right? This is the wisdom of Adam that Adam and Chava had. They weren't just brought into this world and left without any teaching or any instructions at all. That's not possible, says the Zohar. They were given the Eight Zakayim, and indeed later on throughout Jewish history, Shlomo HaMelech takes this word and makes it famous, right? Eight Zakayim hi lemachazikim ba, v'tomcheo meusha, right? Is a reference to what? To the Torah. The Torah is the Eight Zakayim. The Eight Zakayim hi lemachazikim ba is a reference to the Torah in Mishlei. And according to Kabbalah, why does he use this phrase? Because of the Eight Zakayim in Gan Eden, which the Orach Chaim is telling us was a source of Torah. So he says, "V'sheba'emtza'usa tzivahu la'avod Gan Eden, k'moshe pirashti b'posag la'ovda o l'shomra." The Ohr HaChaim HaKadosh, when it says in Bereshis chapter 2 that Adam and Chava were put into Gan Eden la'ovda u l'shomra, to work it and to guard it. So the simple meaning is they were put in Gan Eden and they had to work the land and protect it. But actually it doesn't make sense. What, they were put into Gan Eden to be gardeners? And it's not true, because when they're thrown out of Gan Eden, they're told, now you have to work the land. So what does it mean, la'ovda or l'shamra? Says the Zohar, and brought down by the Ohr HaChaim, la'ovda means mitzvahs asay, and l'shamra means mitzvahs losas. The positive and negative mitzvahs, they were given in the Eight Zakayim. They were living a life la'ovda or l'shamra, so they already had mitzvahs, right? He says, however, don't make a mistake about it. Lo nitztavo elo azayim mitzvahs. They were only instructed, the chiyuv ha-mitzvah, the obligation was only the 7 mitzvahs which later on were attributed to Noach. But the rest of the mitzvahs were available to them in the form of knowledge, right? The 7 mitzvahs b'nei Noach she'im yavro aleim yaharig, aber shar ha-Torah, the rest of the Torah, korov l'scharim yaseh, would be beneficial to him if he did them. But if he didn't keep them, it wouldn't be terrible for him. So that's really the answer of the Ohr HaChaim HaKadosh to his question. How is it that Yaakov transfers the birthright from Reuven to Yosef? So his answer is that pre-Matan Torah, there were no obligations. It's true, he knew the Torah, but he was allowed to use his own seichel to decide that in certain circumstances, like for example here, Reuven, Shimon, Levi were not suitable to be called the Bechor, but he divided up the Bechorah between Yehuda and Yosef. Right? Yosef got that part of the Bechorah which was the Malchus, became the leader, and Yosef got that part of the Bechorah which was the double portion. He divided it up between Yehuda and Yosef, and the others were simply not worthy to have it. It's true, it says in the Torah you can't do that, but he was not obligated to do it. Before Matan Torah, there were no chiyuvim. So here we have, I think it's a very beautiful piece of text that tells us quite clearly a Kabbalistic tradition that we wouldn't know without the Ohr HaChaim HaKadosh, unless you were students of the Zohar, which I'm not, and I guess that many of you are not either. So there was a Torah knowledge available. When Rashi says, for example, at the beginning of Vayetze, that before Yaakov went to Lavan's house, he went for how many years it was? Like 14 years, I think. He went and he learned in the yeshiva of Shem V'Ever, right? So the question is, what is he learning there? What are they teaching there in yeshiva Shem V'Ever? The Ohr HaChaim says, no, they had the Eight Zakayim. They had a type of knowledge, which was a spiritual knowledge, and it was a forerunner, so to speak, of Matan Torah. They didn't yet have the mitzvahs. There were no chiyuvim of the mitzvahs. Right? So just to summarize now, we've looked at about a dozen different mefarshim. We've looked at Rashi, the Sforno, we've looked at the Ramban, we've looked at the Ohr HaChaim HaKadosh, and we've come to an understanding that actually Chazal definitely give us a statement that the Avos kept the mitzvahs, right? But the Mefarshim are divided on the question about how literally to take that. Some of them say it's just a regular metaphor, it means they were people of great spiritual standing. Others, like the Ohr HaChaim HaKadosh, say no. When it says they kept the mitzvahs, it means they knew the mitzvahs, they learned the mitzvahs. They had a real body of knowledge and wisdom coming down from Eight Zakayim, right? But they just weren't obligated in it, and that's why they were able to marry 2 sisters, etc. That's why they were able to do that, right? And then there is the Rambam who takes the whole thing as a complete metaphor, right? The Rambam also doesn't accept that there was a primordial Torah. The Rambam's view is that actually before Matan Torah, nobody knew anything about the Torah. And they were living Sheva Mitzvah B'nai Noach, they were living a moral life. It's true, Avraham Avinu was teaching Emunah, was teaching Chesed, but actually, no Torah knowledge. So what you have here is, and I think one has to, it's a bit more mind expanding, I think. When you learn Chumash as children, you're told this is it, this is what it means, this is what Rashi says, it's one dimensional. When you get a bit more into learning Torah B'iyun, you realize that Torah is multi-layered. There are various different options which are all true at some level. Various different options about how to learn the Chumash, right? So if somebody asks you the following question, was Avraham Avinu walking around wearing tzitzis? Okay, it's a good question. So the answer is, well, it depends how you learn Chazal. If you learn it like Rashi, then yes, he was wearing tzitzis, right? If you learn it like the Arachayim and the Rambam, then it was optional. He was allowed to wear it or not wear it as he wished. If you learn it according to the Rambam, it simply means, now, of course he wasn't wearing mitzvahs, but it means that the kedusha that we associate with wearing tzitzis, Avraham Avinu achieved through his own ruchnius by bringing a merkava lashchina. So you have different options in Chazal. But do me a favor, don't teach this to your 6-year-old, okay? When your grandchild comes in and says, you know what, I just learned Rashi, and Rashi says that Avraham Avinu kept all the mitzvahs. Don't say to them, yes, but you haven't read the Arachai. Let the children enjoy the midrashim. You following me? The kids come back from kindergarten and say, oh, guess what? The stones underneath Yaakov's heads were fighting with each other and arguing with each other. And say to them, wow, isn't that fantastic? That's the most amazing. Don't tell them, no, it's a metaphor, it's a medrash. Don't tell them that. Kids need to live with the midrashim, and it makes life very exciting. And hopefully, when they're a little bit older, more mature, they will revisit these psukim and revisit these midrashim, and they'll read them slightly in a more mature way. So you have to really understand that within Torah itself, there are different levels of learning and different levels of ideas. But I find this particular topic very inspirational and very interesting to get an idea of who were the Avos and the Imohos, how did they live, and what their life's work was like. That's it, ladies and gentlemen. That's it for today.